On behalf of Marquette Law School and the Marquette College of Education, I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here. I always say increasingly senior fellow here. We have had a long run of education programs at the Lubar Center going back more than a decade now. A couple times a year we try to get together to have a serious and I hope interesting and I hope helpful conversation about major education issues. I preface getting into this program by saying we're doing lots of other things at the Lubar Center. We really have returned to pretty much a full agenda, and I think next year even more so. We do have a new director by the name of Derek Mosley, a really good and ambitious guy who happens to be out of town for a speaking engagement himself today, but I'm sure he extends his welcome. So we're continuing our kind of classic programs such as this, and we're expanding into some new areas. Just yesterday we had a program that I think will become a series, kind of a little more intimate and informal version of our long time On the Issues programs. Yesterday it was Derek talking with Dale Kayanga, the new incoming head of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. There'll be more like that. Derek also, he's a big foodie, as some of you may know, and we're getting involved in putting on cultural food events. There was one in February that sold out in about 7 minutes on black chefs and cooks historically who had created foods. And there's one coming up, I believe it's May 7th, on Asian foods. I believe that sold out in about 12 minutes. So they've both been very popular. So stay tuned for things we do at the Lubar Center, but we're going to keep doing the things we've been doing for so long, such as this. I think this is our third education program in the course of this school year. We had Anya Kamenetz here in the fall talking about her new book on the impact of the pandemic on students, children. We had a program after the election in November on like what's ahead for education in Wisconsin. We still haven't quite figured that out, but the state budget will eventually get passed. And then we were talking about what should we do at this point in the year. And I said, well, the most interesting, but in some ways difficult to wrestle with issue is teachers. Interesting and important because what's more important to a school than a teacher? And difficult because it's such an amorphous subject. I don't remember how many schools in the country. I've seen the number. Everyone has teachers. Everyone has teacher issues. The broad issues are a little hard to wrestle with. I said, well, we need to find someone who can really provide some national perspective. And almost literally at that minute, I get an email every weekday from Brookings on kind of 3 things they highlight. Anyone's welcome to sign up for this. True. And like that day, there was a piece discussing the merits of an idea that's been floated in Congress, the U.S. Congress, to set a national floor of $60,000 a year for teacher salaries. And I read it. I thought, hey, this is a lot of good observations and some serious perspective. And I said, let's bring that guy to Milwaukee if we can. And so we are pleased to welcome Michael Hansen here. He is, let me get the title correct, the Senior Fellow and the Herman and George R. Brown Chair on Education Policy at the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He's been quoted in lots of places all around the country, news organizations and so on, appeared at many conferences. On his CV, which I happen to have here, there's a long list of academic institutions he's visited. We are very pleased to add Marquette Law School and Marquette University to that list and welcome him here. Mike is going to talk a little bit, some overviews on what's going on with teachers, and we labeled it Strengthening the Teaching, the World of Teaching. And then he and I will have some conversation. Following that, we will have a panel discussion with several local or at least locally based people, also have some broader perspectives. So, and we'll have opportunities for questions and comments from all of you. So welcome, and let me turn this over to Michael Hansen.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is a great crowd to be with. I'm glad to be here. So today, I'm going to first start off by providing just an overview of some of my comments and my perspective on what's happening with the state of the teacher workforce. And then it'll be 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll go to that conversation. But the motivating question here, at least for my opening statements, is how bad is it? And I think that's a question that's probably burning on many people's minds here in the room. And just to state at the outset, it's really hard to have a complete picture of what's going on, just because teacher labor forces and workforces, they're highly localized. Of course, they're not, we don't really monitor them in a central way. Even states, they don't really generally monitor them closely. It's usually the districts that are monitoring them most closely, and the schools themselves. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a lot of different pieces and considering different pieces of evidence to draw some conclusions. But we have to acknowledge that these conclusions are limited to the places that we do have data. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and noise that's happening in the wings, but I think it's just relevant to start off by just saying that this is sort of the best we can figure out, or at least from my perspective, what I can see. And so first, let me just start off by adding this, or putting this conflict slide out there. So these are recent headlines about ways that schools and teachers have been, how they are under fire in various ways. So we have things including teachers leaving schools, forcing schools to cancel classes, unruly school board meetings. We have anti-CRT measures, unions getting blamed for the COVID learning losses, et cetera. And so I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with all of these various issues, and we recognize that there's a lot of tension and a lot of fire and hostility that is being felt in the classroom, and that is very real, and a lot of this is very new. And so, and I'm going to acknowledge that we are in fairly new territory, so it's not entirely clear, for example, how anti-CRT rhetoric is impacting teachers' morale and how they can discuss things in class, and ultimately whether that makes them want to leave or not. So there's a lot of new questions here, but there's also some old questions too. And so I'm going to try to do my best to tell you what we do know and offer some perspective there. First off, from what we can tell, things are bad locally, but they're not catastrophic globally. Okay, and so what I mean here is, and so going back to what I just said a moment ago. Teacher labor markets are very localized, and so what we see is that we do see a lot of problems in a lot of different places, but we don't see major problems that are sort of engulfing the entire system. And so maybe let me use a metaphor here. We, for many years, even before the pandemic. For many years, we have known that we are camped next to a river, or we're a town next to a river. Okay, let's pretend that we're a town next to a river, and this river does have occasional flooding, and we know that this occasional flooding happens. It happens around recessions. There are issues sometimes, and there's also parts of our community that get flooded all the time. And they're in the river bottoms, and they're the disadvantaged communities. We know that there are problems there. We haven't actually invested in the infrastructure to really help those communities, but they've just had problems all the time. And we just, we kind of shrug our shoulders and deal with it. And then right now, from what we can tell, it looks like, from my assessment, we have been in a flood stage for the last few years during the pandemic. The question is, as we've entered this flood stage, sort of how far outside of the banks the flood is going to spread. And it looks like it has certainly affected more areas and more schools than historically. So it's not just the river bottom schools that are now being affected. It's also some of your suburban schools. And so there are places that are getting more affected, but from what we could tell, it's not sort of sweeping and we have feet of water everywhere. It is a problem. There are real things that we do need to do to mitigate the damage and to assess and rebuild. But my statements are that my main statement is that it's not totally out of the range of what we've seen historically. Things are bad, but they're not crazy bad. And so to sort of put a finer point on that, we have seen elevated teacher turnover. In fact, for the first couple of years post-pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about elevated turnover, but it was actually, in most places, it was actually below historical norms. The most recent set of turnover data that we've seen, and this is coming out of about 7 or 8 states that we've seen some data, turnover is a little bit elevated, but it's elevated on the order of about 1 or 2 percentage points. So just to put a point on that, it's from about, if typical teacher turnover is roughly about 12 to 14 percentage points that you'd get year to year, this past school year transition during the summer of 22 going into this current academic school year, it's now elevated to 15 to 16 percentage points. So it is elevated, certainly, and that is a lot of teachers, if you sort of do the math and put that out there. But it is not, we're not talking about jumping up to 25%, for example. That would be a catastrophe. So also an important thing to know is that many schools are actually staffing at higher levels than what was happening pre-pandemic. The reason why they're at higher levels is we have this influx of ESSER funding to stimulate, for pandemic stimulus funds. And we've also, many school districts have lost student enrollment. And so on a per student enrollment basis, we're actually staffing at higher levels as well. We also have higher levels of stress and burnout among teachers, and this is very real. But I also want to note that from what we could tell looking at other studies and looking at other professions, it does not appear to be unique to teaching. So many occupations have been experiencing higher levels of stress and burnout, particularly sort of these frontline industries or frontline occupations, And so that's not to say that this isn't something that we shouldn't that we should just dismiss. We should certainly deal with it, but it's not necessarily a red flag here. And as I said, all of the places that have the most acute problems are the places that have always had the flooding, even before the pandemic, and that we've shrugged our shoulders about. And my view is that we should be doing more to make sure that those communities have resilience, and that so that they don't have these catastrophes happening all the time, and and the catastrophes are only occasionally spilling out into sort of more public view. Okay, so my next thesis is that today's problems are probably not permanent problems, and there's a few pieces of silver lining here. So we have some recent upticks in teacher training enrollments and completions. I will put a little caveat on that. A lot of the uptick is in alternatively certified programs, not exclusively limited to them, but many of them are in alternatively certified programs, and there's, especially in a subset of alternatively certified programs, there is concern about quality of teachers coming from those programs. Also, ESSER funds are drying up in the near future, and we know that we suspect that marginal vacancies, so these are vacancies that were sort of created with these new funds, they're not going to get filled. Surely some of them are, but many of them will not be filled, and they just go away, and they're not going to be reopened again. And given that my statement a moment ago, where we're staffing at higher levels in schools, it's not necessarily that we're now going to, the kids are going to take over the schools, right? But like we have adults in the building, and this is manageable. And there is concern that with ESSER funds drying up, we may even be worrying about teacher layoffs within 2 years. Especially those are especially pressing concerns in places that have lost a lot of enrollment. I'm not exactly sure what Milwaukee's enrollment looks like, but many urban areas are in that scenario where they've lost 1% to 2%, maybe even more in some places of their student enrollment. Also, I want to emphasize that quality of the teacher workforce, not just quantity, is important here. And oftentimes, during this conversation about teacher shortages, really we're focusing about quantity. But we do know that teacher quality is tremendously important. It is, we know that there are impacts on student outcomes in various ways, whether it's on learning, whether it's on socio-emotional outcomes, looking at high school graduation, even looking at things into their college-going behaviors, and even into their employment. So we do know that teacher quality is a critical issue, and if we're just focusing on shortages, we often ignore that element as well. And so I just want to elevate that as part of our conversation, that this is something we need to think about and be concerned about. And we also know that teacher quality is not evenly distributed. It's the same river bottom communities that frequently have these teacher staffing challenges in terms of quantity. They also suffer the same challenges in terms of quality. Okay, an interesting sort of facet here is that oftentimes we use traditional measures of qualifications like master's degrees or an experienced teacher, et cetera, to sort of signal the level of quality that a school has or a district has access to. And those typical qualifications, those are useful measures, but they are insufficient measures in terms of teacher quality. They're actually they are correlated, but fairly weakly correlated with actual student outcomes, for example, or other measures of teacher quality that may include things like observational ratings of teachers' performance based on how they're instructing kids, and also student assessments of teachers. So those are some things to think about as well. So quality doesn't. I guess where I'm going with that is quality does not necessarily very neatly map onto the way we typically think about, the suburban schools, get all the experienced teachers and the master's degrees, et cetera. Okay. And I just want to end with this discussion about a $60,000 salary floor for teachers. This is something that, as Alan mentioned, has been proposed, and in my view, this is something that is an interesting idea, though it's not something that I personally feel very committed to. And I would say, in fact, I would say we should be doing something different. Like if we're going to be doing something big with teachers, it probably should not be a $60,000 salary minimum. And the reason why is because I do feel like money is important to teachers, but it's not the most important. Other things that are important include support for teachers, especially new teachers as they're onboarding and starting in their careers. Also having access to resources, classroom material. They also feel that they're getting supported from their school leaders who have their back, especially in times where there's hostile parental pressures potentially that are coming at them. Also, the reason I don't feel very great about a sort of a blanket minimum salary is that the cost of living and varying outside opportunity costs for teachers. They vary tremendously, both across teachers and across schools and locations. And so I think there's a lot of reason to be skeptical that just sort of a one-size-fits-all solution is going to actually work here. And so my argument is that we have a complex problem here with the teacher workforce, and it's going to require some complex thinking. And finally, there could be some potential adverse consequences of an increased, sort of just general increases in teacher salaries. So, for example, I suspect, and based on the evidence, we have every reason to believe that if we dramatically raise the floor on teacher pay, we are almost certainly going to get more men in the teacher workforce, and many people would say that's a good thing, though that may not necessarily be true. And we're also going to have fewer teachers of color. Almost not a guarantee, but likely that is likely the outcome, because these things have been correlated in the past. And so, I guess let me just state, I do agree with the general premise that teachers do need to be paid more, and we do need to compensate them adequately for their work, though I don't feel like just giving everyone $60,000 is the way to do it. And rather, my argument would be that we should be paying more for teacher pay in critical settings and critical subjects. And not just paying a little bit more, but especially in the high-need settings, we should be paying them a lot more. And typically, a lot more is on the order of about 20 to 30% of their pay, and not just a few percentage points, which is commonly the practice in many places that do have some form of hard to staff setting pay. Also, my argument is that we should be factoring in quality somewhere, somehow. I don't have a strong prescription about exactly how we do it, but I do think we should be having conversations and putting those policies into place to reward teacher quality in some way. And also, we don't need to make teachers get master's degrees. I just want to be very clear that we don't have a lot of evidence that, in fact, we have a lot of evidence that says master's degrees don't really help very much. They put teachers in debt. It's the leading source of debt among teachers. Well, I won't say the only people that gets money off of this is the universities, but that's probably not a great state. A great look. Sorry, but we should also be doing more to. We should just be paying them at that higher rate, just because they're teachers, not because we're forcing them to get a master's degree. That most of them don't really feel like it actually helps them all that much. And finally, we should also, if we're going to be supporting salaries, we should also be really focusing on pre-K. And that is, we do know that there is a lot of strong evidence that pre-K it really does have some long-term benefits for the students who are enrolled. But many states are lagging behind on, of course, we have seen a lot of progress over the last 5 years. I'm not going to diminish that. But we should be doing more to expand enrollment in pre-K, and then also support teachers who are in pre-K to actually have livable wages as well. Okay, so that summarizes my statements. And so, Alan, let's go to the conversation.
Yeah, I guess let's sit down at this table here.
Okay.
Over here, if people can see us, I hope so. And chat a bit. How much of a factor at the moment is the pandemic and post-pandemic in shaping the experiences teachers are having? The follow-up question was, how much was the polarization shaping that seems to be going on nationwide, shaping the experiences teachers are having? So, pandemic first.
Pandemic first. From what I can see, the pandemic and the consequent overwork the additional outreach to students, the bouncing back and forth between virtual instruction versus the live instruction, the frequent COVID testing, that certainly did have an impact on teachers and their feelings of burnout. And I do feel that that was very real. But I do feel like the actual sort of pandemic response, I feel like we're over that bump now. I suspect that we probably won't be going back to that same level as what we've had, especially what we had, in that first Delta wave, as schools were trying to reopen and everything. So I suspect that we're generally out of the ballpark there. However, since the pandemic, of course, there's been this wave of anti-CRT discussion, of can't talk about LGBT issues in classrooms, sex ed in classrooms in general. I feel like those issues are not going away, and those issues are things that they really do impact teachers. In fact, I believe, from my perspective, one of the reasons why we have been able to pay teachers as little as we do is that we rely on their intrinsic motivation to come and serve kids and to come and serve their communities. And what that is doing is that's also, when we're getting people, responding to those intrinsic motivations, what we're implicitly doing is we are getting people to come in to be advocates and to be sort of change agents. Often, they see themselves as change agents. They see themselves as creating a new future where things are going to be different. And many of the current conversations about anti-CRT, anti-LGBT issues, I feel like those many of these issues do hit close to home for many of our teachers, because they do feel like what has brought them into teaching has been those motivations to want to make things better for the next generation. And so I think that's a very real issue, and I feel concern for that especially. So we are seeing a divergence of sort of education policy in red states versus blue states, and I do have concern that we will see some response in sort of the teacher workforce as to how, whether teachers, if they're feeling systematically silenced, if they are feeling like they can't talk about issues that are important to them, that they may feel that I'd rather just leave and do something else. Now, having said that, let me also say that I am of the opinion that oftentimes we have a picture of teachers that they are sort of superheroes and that they're going to do everything, and teachers themselves also have, in a way, that like these grandiose visions of what they need to be doing, and I feel that perhaps part of this is a need to speak to everything, and not maybe not even that. So, but a need to operate in many different hats, or under many different roles that, in a way, puts too many, requires teachers to wear too many hats. And I think what we could also be doing as school leaders, policymakers, and leaders in this space, we should be thinking about what we can do to sort of limit the number of hats that a teacher has to wear, and providing more support services for students, and taking them off the shoulders of teachers and putting them onto other people who can better manage or better hold those responsibilities.
Just this morning, I see that the EdWeek website has an opinion piece headlined, Stop Bad-Mouthing Teaching, and that in some ways, the education world itself is discouraging people from going and teaching by focusing on how bad the work is, how difficult the work is. What can be done to encourage people to go into teaching?
What can be done to encourage people to go into teaching? Well, I think there is a very strong service ethos that I think that we really want to still be part of that call to teach, and there are many people who want to impact their communities in that way. So I don't feel that we need to dramatically change what we do with how we try to get people into the field. Though I do think that increasing teacher pay would be a huge benefit, especially increasing pay, especially in fields where we have shortages like STEM, special education, and if that were widely known, and then also if it was very clear that there is a commitment to making sure that if you're teaching in a high poverty school setting, that you would also be rewarded very handsomely for doing so there. And so there's a lot of evidence to believe, or a lot of evidence to support that that many college-going individuals, college graduates, would consider teaching under the right circumstances. And typically, the right circumstances means I'm going to be getting paid a little bit more than what is getting paid right now, and also, having some sense of sort of pride and prestige, sort of socially, sort of social cachet that I think is important. And so on that note, I do feel that social or depictions of teaching in popular media, and so I'm thinking of things like Abbott Elementary. It's funny, but also it sort of it's kind of it highlights dysfunctional schools, and and so I worry that those kinds of things in fact make more negative or create more negative associations or perceptions of teaching more so than anything else, at least among the broad community. I mean, I don't think it really moves the needle on teachers' opinions or people who are close to teaching, but it does move the needle in the community at large. Also, like Breaking Bad or those kinds of things, right? So, a little bit of a soapbox. Sorry.
You talked a little bit about teacher quality. I want to expand on that. Best as you can tell, nationwide, has quality changed in the last 10 or 20 years, either for the better or the worse?
So that's genuinely a very hard question to answer.
Yeah.
And the reason why...
I only ask the questions.
And so I'm going to answer this in two ways. So I'm going to answer by talking first about qualifications, and then I'm going to answer second by talking about quality. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, qualifications and quality, they do have some correlation, but it's a fairly weak correlation. If we're looking specifically at qualifications, in fact, historically, looking over the past 30 or 40 years, since around the NCLB era, so this is 2001, 2002. From that time, we have seen a pretty strong uptick in the qualifications of individuals who are entering the classroom. So coming from more selective colleges and universities, for example, higher GPAs while they were in school. And so there is an uptick. Now, by no means does this mean everybody, like we're getting valedictorians, like every teacher's a valedictorian. No, that's not the answer. But where there had been a fairly negative trend into teaching through the 80s and 90s, that trend definitely has reversed and has the trajectory is moving in the opposite direction. So qualifications looks very good, or it looks promising. I wouldn't say it's entirely, we would entirely resolve that, but it's generally strong. Now let's talk about the quality portion, And when we say quality, typically we're talking about some kind of the actual process of instruction or teaching is materially better, or the outcomes that it's producing is materially better. And it's really hard to state absolutely whether it's improved or not, because when we're measuring those things, we're doing so within a context, within a context of this particular district or this particular state, and we don't really have good ways to sort of track that productivity over time. And as a result, it's really hard to say whether teachers today are actually more productive for their students now versus 10 years ago. And so I'm going to say it's genuinely unknown, and I would even say that would be an unknowable answer or question, rather, to really know if teacher quality has truly changed. Now, in some districts, in some settings, we have observed those changes as they have put policies into place. They have documented over time within smaller settings that, for example, as stronger teacher evaluation systems have gone in place in some districts, weaker teachers, they feel weak teachers often leave those settings at higher rates, and stronger teachers stay in those settings at higher rates. And there's been a number of studies that have found, more or less that same finding. And so in those sort of smaller circumstances, we can say that for sure teacher quality is improving. Access to teacher quality for the students that are teaching, that is improving as well. But sort of on a macro perspective, looking at the overall workforce, we can't say that, and I don't think that we're going to be able to get there anytime soon.
10 or 15 years ago, I think there was a lot more advocacy for the notion of merit pay for teachers, tied to test scores, tied to observations, whatever. I don't think you hear much about that anymore, and I think the main reason is it didn't work. I mean, test scores proved to be really unsuccessful as a way of judging teachers. Is there such a thing as merit pay? Is the idea still alive?
It certainly lives on, and I agree with your overall assessment that we don't hear very much about it, but not like we used to. And the national conversation has certainly shifted away from merit pay. My take on where things have landed is that, and as I referenced in my opening statements, is that teacher quality is important, and that does include output based on test scores, but it's not necessarily limited to that either. I suspect that there are very few sort of empirical education economists like me who would say that really we should just be rewarding test scores. Rather, I think most would say that we should be rewarding test scores, and we should be rewarding those who are showing up with high levels of professionalism, and we should be rewarding those that have good observational ratings, and we should be rewarding those that have good student surveys and feedback and are good members of their community. So what I'm describing here is that many discussions, like whenever we talk about teacher quality now, I think most in the field, within the research field, recognize that teacher quality is more than just test scores. And there was, I want to say before ESSA, I feel like ESSA kind of, when ESSA passed, I feel like there was a lot of the, it was sort of like the balloon popped at that moment. And so around issues of teacher quality and merit pay. And up until that point, there had been a lot of action on new districts or states and districts trying new teacher evaluation policies and to strengthen those. And for the most part, in places that had been doing these with fidelity and with care, we have a number of places that really have shown some pretty strong improvements. I'm thinking of Washington, D.C., I'm thinking of Dallas, that have really made some significant strides, though once we look at it at scale, in places that, as states started sort of rolling these programs out across many districts, the net result was, essentially a nothing burger, if you will, and the question is why? Why does it appear to work well on small scales, but it doesn't really appear to work very well when rolling it out? And this is, from my read on it, this is a question of scale up and what we can do to ensure there's implementation fidelity as we reach broader and broader perspectives. Though I would say in general, places where it has gone into effect and has some staying power, I would say in general the net effect has been quite positive in those places.
Enrollment, I believe nationwide, and for sure in Wisconsin, enrollment in higher education institution teacher training programs has gone down a lot. It went down in Wisconsin after the legendary Act 10 of 2011, which pretty much disempowered teachers' unions and a variety of other things, the Great Scott Walker Civil War. But what happened in Wisconsin was actually by percentage, not too much difference from surrounding states. And as you said, there's been a rise of alternative education, certification, or training programs. What's the quality factors in that?
So my view on alternative certification is that let me just try to order my thoughts here. So number one is that we should be creating ways for people who have some background training already, who have some skills, who, as undergraduates, they did not decide to become teachers, but later decide they want to switch careers and move into teaching. I feel that we should create and remove barriers to enable those kinds of individuals to come into teaching. And so in general, I'm very supportive of the idea of alternative certification and bringing people in through those means without making them necessarily go to school for another year or two before they can teach in the classroom. And so I want to be sort of clear on that. In terms of the actual quality of teachers that show up through alternative certification plans versus traditional teacher training programs, we tend to not see very large differences in the overall quality. Now, overall quality based on student test scores, based on those kinds of metrics. Now, what we do see is we do see a pretty significant difference in the staying power of those who come in through alternative certification programs versus those who do not. Those who come in through alternative certification, the longevity factor is usually, half that of a traditionally trained teacher, and there could be a couple of reasons for this. Number one, if you're alternatively certified, it sort of puts you lower on sort of the competitiveness. Where you're going to go to, where you're going to teach. Okay, so you're not teaching in. If you're alternatively certified, you're typically not going to your elite or suburban schools, but you're typically a competitive candidate in your river bottom kind of communities. Going back to my metaphor from above. And so they are harder environments to work in, and these are places that experience high levels of turnover broadly. So it's hard to separate, is it truly the alternative certification or is it where they're teaching? So that's one part of it. Another part of it is people who are coming in alternatively certified that's a signal that they've had a career previously. But they are starting on the lower end of the teacher pay scale. And so, they're starting at year one of teaching, just like, your starting teachers do. And oftentimes there is a pretty significant pay difference. So they have a greater opportunity cost typically than those who have not been than a typical, an otherwise trained, similarly trained person who has been a teacher the whole time. And so they also they're facing those kinds of issues as well. So they're not being paid as much. And so in general, I feel that we should be doing more to help alternatively certified programs and create those kinds of pathways and support them. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that every alternative pathway into the teaching field is necessarily a great one. We have evidence that there are some great pathways that come in. So, for example, teacher residency programs, they tend to show some pretty strong outcomes. They actually have some pretty strong retention patterns too. We also have places where we have programs like Teach for America that have some pretty strong outcomes for the students, right? So a lot of high quality marks, but very low retention. So we don't really have like a clear model that's going to necessarily, win for everyone. However, I will say that the largest increase, the largest spike in teacher enrollments, I just mentioned we have seen a spike in teacher enrollments and completions recently. The biggest spike is coming from for-profit alternative certification providers, and that's actually something that is concerning to me. And so these are places that, by and large, you could do everything entirely online, entirely remotely. There isn't a practicum component as part of that training, and so I really do worry about quality there. And so. So I guess to your question, Alan, what do we do about alternative certification? And it's complicated, and there's a lot of things to like about it, and there's also places to be concerned.
Not to mention in Wisconsin, we have a lot of teachers on emergency licenses, which is to say we're in the Band-Aid business. But one of the things that made my eyebrows go up was your observation about whether there's going to be a decline potentially in minority teachers or black and brown teachers. There's certainly ample and persuasive research that, so to speak, having a teacher who looks like me is a plus for students. What do we do about that? We need more. I mean, the teaching workforce around here, around the nation, is disproportionately white.
That's right.
What do we do about it?
Okay, so teacher diversity is a challenge across the nation, as you say. Just to put some numbers on it, approximately 20% of the teaching workforce is non-white, so teachers of color, whereas approximately 52-ish or so % of students are students of color. And so there is a pretty large difference in terms of the representation of students to teachers. There are, and as I mentioned in the slide, just to sort of add a little bit more context to that observation, what we see looking across states is that places that pay more also have higher barriers to entry. They also, and when they have higher barriers to entry, that means that we have fewer alternatively certified teachers there. Alternative certification is a major source of teachers of color into teaching. And so we have, whenever we have fewer of those teachers coming in, or those teacher sources coming in, then that's going to sort of mechanically put a lid on the number of people that can work in those situations. So, and generally speaking, those kinds of barriers to entry, like having a traditional four-year undergraduate program for teaching, those are barriers inhibit teachers of color from coming in. Now, what can we what can we do about it? And actually, let me say this before I talk about what we can do about it. I also will say that there is a lot of great and strong evidence that having a teacher of color matters for students, and this matters in a few different ways. We could talk about all the various ways how it impacts teacher expectations. We have culturally relevant pedagogy that they're using. They have role modeling effects that are happening. I could belabor these points for hours if you'd let me, but for the moment, let me just say it's really important, and it's important for students, and it's important for not just sort of in the moment. It's also important long term and in high school and college outcomes as well. So having said that, we actually could do a lot with the teachers of color that we do have right now. We could create more universal access to teachers of color for students. It would require being creative about how we conceptualize how teacher diversity can be a real asset to policymakers and to the school system. Right now, we're not there, but I hope that we can get there and sort of change some conversation. So one of the things. So I recently, with some co-authors, we wrote a book about teacher diversity and student success, and one of our main assertions in that book is that teacher diversity is something that we should consider as part of teacher quality. That doesn't mean it's the only thing that we care about. Just like I mentioned a moment ago, we shouldn't just care about teachers' impact on test scores, but we should care about the fact that teachers from Black and Latino backgrounds, that they impact and help Black and Latino students. And not only that, they also help their exposure, white students, when they're exposed to them, it also helps them too. It helps them to see that they can have empathy, and that they can report to a person of color who is in a superior position to them. And it's good for them, and it helps them in many ways. So now, sorry, I was going on various tangents. So what can we do to actually increase the share of teachers of color in the workforce? As I alluded to, I don't believe that just raising teacher pay is going to do it. And in fact, I think raising teacher pay, like sort of just blanket teacher pay, I think would have a backfiring effect on teachers of color. Rather, I do believe what we should be doing is we could be much more generous with paying teachers more in high need settings. The reason why I say that is because teachers are segregated just as much, or perhaps even more so, than students are, and so a policy that says we're going to pay teachers in high need settings 20 to 25% more, effectively that translates to a pretty major pay raise for the teachers in those settings who are disproportionately teachers of color. And so that's point number one. We could also look at loan forgiveness, much more generous loan forgiveness programs. And I'm not talking about like a $3,000 gift from the Teach Grant or whatever, but like really serious programs for $15,000 per year for each year that you're teaching in a high income a high need setting. So we could be doing that. We could also be looking at lowering barriers, especially barriers around licensure, into the teaching workforce. And so there's a much longer history here, but the long and the short of it is that actually taking the praxis exam or your other licensure exams, that's a pretty strong racialized barrier that many teachers face. And what could we could be doing things differently. We could help, provide some more help for them, perhaps help pay for a certain number of retakes, for example, or we can even just look at, are these tests actually serving the purposes that we want them to? We do know that they are correlated with student outcomes, but they're, like many things in education, they're fairly weakly correlated with student success in the classroom. So, and if you consider the fact that that teachers of color have a disproportionate impact on students of color, then we would actually reverse some of our calculus, and we would say that having a teacher of color in the classroom is actually more important than marginally passing this licensure test. So a few different ideas there.
Let's take questions from anyone here.
Come around with a microphone real quick, though, so just bear with me while I creep through the crowd.
Hi. I heard a lot of conversation around diversity and making sure that that's present in the classroom. I'm just wondering, is there any research around poverty, like being able to have that poverty lens if you haven't come from poverty and you're coming into a classroom where your students are predominantly at or below the poverty level? There's a disconnect, and I don't ever hear anybody talking about poverty as a lens.
That's a great question, and I'm going to agree with you that we actually don't talk about that lens very much. And now, by and large, people who, teachers, though they themselves are not making a ton of money and super high on the income distribution, the fact that they have a bachelor's degree, it does, that in and of itself is a signal of some kind of advantaged background. Perhaps not, it's not terribly advantaged. I'm not saying super elite, but you're right. There is often a disconnect between teachers and the students that they're teaching. And now, one thing that I feel like we should be doing more is we should be leaning into grow your own programs. Many of these grow your own programs are trying to reach students as they're in high school or in college, and encouraging them to try out teaching, and let's take a few classes, let's have some student teaching experience. And they're trying to invite people from those communities to become teachers, then go back to those communities. Some of these programs, in fact, specialize or really lean into paraprofessionals or teacher aides. In my view, we really should be looking at paraprofessionals and other classroom support. We should be looking at that as sort of a starting rung on the teacher ladder, on a teacher career ladder. That's my position. If we have a teacher's aide who's coming in for more than a year or two, and they enjoy it, and they're working well with kids, and they don't have a bachelor's degree, then we should be saying, hey, let's get you trained up, and let's get you your formal training and your formal credential, and then you can become a teacher. And not only that, my view, in my utopian world, if they've been a teacher's aide for 3 or 4 or 5 years, we should be crediting that as classroom experience, and so that way, once they actually start teaching, they're starting with that experience already under their belt, and so that's an even higher. They're not starting teachers anymore; they're experienced teachers.
One of the things that I noticed that you mentioned in your presentation was about paying pre-K teachers more. I'm a human resources director in a K-12 district. I'm also a mother of 2 with 2 young kids in childcare. Childcare costs are astronomical. I can give you a ballpark. We're paying between $2,500 and $3,000 a month for 2 kids, 4 or under, in childcare. Our teachers can't afford that, and so we're seeing women, and 80% of the workforce are female. So we're seeing women leave the workforce because it's more than 50% of their salary to put a kid or 2 kids or 3 kids in childcare. So you increase pre-K teacher salaries, which we absolutely need to do because there's a shortage of early childhood teachers. But then the buck gets passed to the parents who have to pay for childcare. What are we doing to kind of look more closely at childcare costs, childcare shortages, and that's a huge impact on the 80% of female workforce in education. So are we talking about that?
I'm going to punt on this issue And I'm going to say I agree that these are real issues that are hard to grapple with. But I don't specialize in childcare. But I do agree that this is an issue that we really do need to take seriously. And there are far more people that are far more well-versed in the evidence to really say anything about it. The one small thing I will add, but speaking specifically to your point where you're describing how it's hard for teachers on a teacher salary to actually afford childcare. And of course, teachers are disproportionately female, et cetera. One thing that I in my utopian world would be nice is that schools had were to offer more child care centers for their staff, because there is a high complementarity to the fact that we already have a bunch of kids, we're already providing education experiences for all these kids, and I'm not saying that we should have our schools do the full range of daycare for the public, but at least do a small daycare in schools that were available for the area elementary and middle and high school teachers, et cetera, who wanted to use it as a benefit. To me, that feels like a really strong benefit to teachers, and I feel like that is something that it would be very, I'm not going to say easy, but it would be sort of a low-hanging fruit, and there's a lot of complementarity there that we could lean into.
I can venture a thought there. I'm a bit of a fan of Professor James Heckman from Chicago, and the payoff for early childhood quality programs is very high, and it's never really going to spread unless we ever figure out how to pay the people who work in that field living salaries without making it too burdensome on parents. From what I read in the newspaper and such, there was actually a fair amount of progress during the pandemic period because all this federal money was available. That's about to end, which is to say things are going to get worse. That's not good. Okay.
Yeah, and which goes to the point why I think the public should be doing more, like when I say public, government services should actually be doing more to support preschool and potentially other child care salaries as well.
There's no solution that can be just dumped on parents. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Alan, if we could do one more question and then
yes,
we'll
I was going to say,
break.
let's take one more question at this point.
Perfect.
Good morning.
Mike
Hey, how are you?
I'm glad you're here.
Good to see you. The one thought comes to mind, in Milwaukee, there are schools that are getting about $8,400 per pupil. Different districts in the state, I think up to $21,000 per pupil. Play that math out, about a school of 1,000 kids, it's $12 million annually. Can you talk a little bit about like the implications for teacher pay, opening up a daycare in a school if we don't figure out state funding, more equitable state funding across districts in the state?
This is a hot issue in Wisconsin at the moment with the state budget coming.
So I cannot comment exactly on what Wisconsin's funding inequities look like, though I will say that a very bright spot within the education research world is that school funding has become significantly more equitable over the last 2 decades or so. And such that, and broadly speaking, nationally, perhaps not in Wisconsin. I'm saying not in Wisconsin. Okay, and so this is a bright spot nationally, where of course there used to be, for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, they would be systematically in schools that were getting 15 to 20% less per student. And now, in general, the average is that disadvantaged students are getting about 1 to 2 percentage points more than in terms of school per pupil funding than non-disadvantaged peers. So it's not a huge difference, and is that 1 to 2 percentage points more in funding enough to compensate for the disadvantaged backgrounds they're coming from? My argument would be no. So we probably should be doing even more than what we have right now, but it is a bright spot in that it has really changed significantly in the past. I don't know. So I don't know what exactly how Michigan gets there. I do know, or excuse me, Wisconsin gets there. I do know that Michigan, for example, they, during the 2000s, there was a court case, and I don't know all the details, but I do know that there was some pretty through the adequacy, this what's considered the adequacy era of basically a guarantee. We should be doing more to guarantee a minimum level of service for disadvantaged students in disadvantaged communities. And I do know that this court case in the early 2000s, it really made a huge difference in the state of Michigan. And I imagine that by and large, that has been the path for most states to get to more equitable funding now, has been through these kinds of lawsuits. Where there's a major lawsuit that gets many people to sign on, and they're showing that it's totally inadequate levels of funding, and that the state has to do something to step in. And so I suspect that may be the way forward for Wisconsin too.
We are going to take a break here of, let's say, 10 minutes, which I agree usually becomes 15 minutes. There is coffee and other goods over there. The bathrooms behind the elevators out here and elsewhere. Stick around. We've got a really interesting panel, and I believe we'll bring Mike back at the end to react to what he hears from the panel, too. Okay. So thank you very much for being with us, Mike Hansen.
Thank you.
All right. We have 4 interesting and smart people up here who each have a stake in this whole subject, and I'm eager to hear their thoughts. I will briefly introduce them because I want them to do the talking. We'll start at this end of the table. Monica Kelsey-Brown is the superintendent of Brown Deer Schools. Was prior to that the director of teaching and learning. And her background was at UW-Whitewater for quite a while, was a teacher in MPS for quite a while, has a PhD from UW-Madison. Brown Deer is certainly a district that has had to work with a lot of these issues related to teacher development, and has had, going back to your predecessor, Deb Kerr, and certainly now a remarkable commitment and success in building a diverse staff and a diverse leadership, more so than I think any other district in this region. Leigh Van Den Kieboom, I think I've got the accent on the right syllable, is the Associate Dean of the College of Education at Marquette, which frankly means she's basically the dean. And is by background, your specialty is math education, but is heading up the important work being done on actual teacher education, which is what this is all about here. And Ingrid Walker-Henry is also has a background as a math teacher, is a vice president and organizer and leader of the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association with a specialty in teacher development and coaching. And Leanne Fraley has a really interesting history. I don't know what she does. She works for what I still call the New Teacher Project, TNTP, which is officially known as TNTP. I've never asked the question, why did you change it to TNTP? But okay.
Another day.
And a early and strong background in Teach for America. And among other things, just as in the last couple days, finished 6 years as a member of the Wauwatosa School Board. And I'd like to start with the entirely vague and unspecific question of, for each of you, your stake in this subject and what you see happening, trends in teachers and the quality of teachers, and our main subject. What would it take to strengthen teaching staffs as you work with them. But let's start with Dr. Kelsey-Brown. We got a couple microphones that are supposed to be on there. Yeah?
Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. So what we're currently seeing in the school district of Brown Deer in particular, starting with COVID, we experienced a mass exodus as well. And part of it was around teachers understanding the climate that they're currently working in that I can go to District B and ask for the salary that I would like, or even make more money than I'm currently making, which gets back to the resources, the inequities in the resources across the state in terms of per pupil costs. But with that being said, we have been able to turn the corner and recruit a new cadre of teachers, and some are first year teachers and others are coming from other school districts. And we are happy and proud to be able to say that we have recruited a really good cadre of teachers. And that, again, stems from first year all the way to teachers who've been in the profession for quite some time. So we're very proud to be able to say that. You even hear teachers in the building who've been with us for quite some time say, wow, you did a really nice job of recruiting a good cadre of teachers who want to work. Number one, you have to have the will to want to work we're a very diverse school district in that we're 70% students of color, 50% free and reduced lunch. We have about a 16% special education population, and then our EL population is about 8%. Do I have that right, Ms. Ramos? And so the diversity speaks for itself in Brown Deer. And so what I share with individuals who want to come to our district is, while we know education is a calling, it is an elevated calling in a very diverse school district, because you have to have the will, the knowledge, and the empathy to want to work with a diverse group of students. And so we've seen teachers come and go in that regard. But we have more who have stayed because that is what they want. That is the population of students that they want to work with. In terms of the quality, we're seeing good quality. And when I say good quality, it is not just a test score, but it is building relationships with students, having effective classroom management, being able to construct lesson plans that are high quality, and having high expectations for students. So for us, we are building back to where we were as it relates to bringing teachers back into the school district. One of the things, and I'm going to stop, but one of the things that I was just sharing with a group just in this space is it is time for us to begin to think about, to be really creative and innovative around how we, quote unquote, do school, and how we show up, how we ask our teachers to show up for our students every day. In that, what I will say is I am concerned about the SEL, or the socio-emotional state of our teachers. It is the heavy lifting now, post-pandemic, is different. And while our students experienced a pretty significant amount of trauma pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, it is unlike anything I've ever seen this is my 33rd year in education, and it is very, very different. And let's not forget, we're asking our teachers to shoulder that every day. In addition to what I'm also learning is our teachers' children are also experiencing some of the remnants of whatever transpired through COVID. So trying to balance that has become, we should have a heightened sense of awareness around asking our teachers to balance that. And while we claim that they're superheroes, I think that is not a term that they want anymore, because at this point it's exhausting. And so we celebrate them, yes, but what we're asking them to do, we have to take a step back and figure out how can we do it different so that the work can be even more meaningful and more impactful on our staff as well as our students. Did I answer your question?
Yes, very well. Okay.
Thanks, Monica. Leigh Van Den Kieboom again, College of Education. I've been at Marquette University since 2000, and I prepare K-12 math teachers. So I'm part of the pipeline that sends teachers to the Brown Deer District. Let me just give you some numbers over my time at Marquette University for undergraduate teacher education preparation. And before I do that, I also want to insert the idea that educational leaders are part of this puzzle as well, preparing principals, district administrators, superintendents, and this is a high need as well. Probably our high mark at Marquette University in my time has been a incoming class of 87 teachers. May 1st, next Monday, is the deposit day for universities across the country. And like every other teacher education program across the country, we're down by about 30 to 35%. So we've been welcoming first-year classes of around 35 to 40 students. And then let me just give you a few other numbers. We always host a fall and spring mock interview session with principals in the area. This spring, we have 32 student teachers who are looking for positions in districts. We had 23 administrators at our interview night. So we're almost getting to the point where we have more administrators than we do teachers. I tell parents the good news is that we have a 100% job placement rate. And then as a STEM educator, I'm really concerned about STEM. The local comment that Michael brought up, if you're missing a high school chemistry teacher and can't find that position to fill, this is a critical, acute problem in your district that we need to be mindful of. And then let me just talk about quality, because we are licensed through the Department of Public Instruction. And so when I welcome our students, prospective math teachers, into my integrated STEM methods with my colleague Jill Buren over here, we always remind them that like doctors, architects, CPAs, they're getting a license to practice. And that license has 10 standards. And I love that the first 3 standards center students. Teachers hold highly specialized knowledge. By the way, early childhood teachers have an extraordinary amount of highly specialized knowledge. I could rifle off, for example, the 8 stages of development that a 4-year-old goes through when learning how to count. So our students are prepared using these standards, and I remind them that the profession is a licensed profession, and I oftentimes elicit the heart surgeon or the brain surgeon, that we have highly specialized knowledge. We assess students, we diagnose, just like a medical professional would, and then we treat through instruction. All the students in our care. So highly specialized knowledge for our teachers, and a little bit about the difference in the numbers at Marquette University and other universities in our local context and across the country.
Thank you. Once again, Ingrid Walker-Henry. I am a 23-year teacher in Milwaukee Public Schools. So I get to do a lot of speaking from just my personal experience in some of this. What I will say is one of the things Alan asked about was trends. What we have in the state of Wisconsin is a purposeful disinvestment in public education. It has been going on for decades. The talk against workers in education, going on for decades. And at this time, we are reaping what we have sown. We have a $7.1 billion budget surplus. That surplus was amassed on the backs of our students. Across this state, rural, suburban, urban, educators and districts are currently begging the Joint Finance to do better than even what Governor Evers proposed, because ESSER was a one-time shot. The state of Wisconsin decided not to even increase per pupil funding during that time, saying that, hey, ESSER will fill the gap. Our students, our school districts, they continue to fall further and further behind. So when we talk about trends, we're not on a good trend. We are going down. When we talk about recruitment and retention, money is not everything. I completely and totally agree. Working conditions also play into what we need to be discussing. But I will say this. Childcare is an industry dominated by women, and that includes from preschool through the K-12 pipeline. And for some reason, that work has not always been honored, and it has not been compensated for the skill that is taken to do that. So, continuing in what I see in trends, we have deprived students and honestly families of basic needs. We continue to shrink the social safety net, and then we look to places like the schoolhouse to continue to provide those extra things. And once again, I don't think that a school, a district, or anybody would begrudge it, but we also ask for the funds to do so, the resources, the people, everything needed to ensure that a child is whole and happy and healthy. So when I think about what's my stake in this is my profession. This is what I've chosen to do with my life. I don't think it's a waste. I know it's not a waste. I look at the fact that I have a child. I'm sure there are other people in here who have children or children that you love in your life, and you want the absolute best for them. And I think people around this room will say, we don't feel like we're doing that. We are failing. We have to do better. So I just want people to really think about what is happening and what we are doing as a whole to work on actually fixing the issue.
Thank you. This is really hard work, and I just want to call out everybody in the room for being here because you're doing the hard work out in schools and districts and colleges of ed, et cetera. My name's Leigh Fraley. I am a resident of Wauwatosa, 48 hours off the Wauwatosa School Board, and not that I'm counting.
And missing it horribly.
And I have worked at TNTP since 2000, and I am a former teacher, school leader, licensed, et cetera. And my stake in this goes back actually to something Dr. Hansen said, which is the ethos of service. I come from a family. My dad's a colonel in the Army. My brother is a commander in the Navy. My mom was a teacher. Every part of my family connects with service, and my service was through education. So I also want to say I'm not speaking for Wauwatosa School District, nor am I speaking for TNTP. What I share with you today is my thoughts as I've experienced them over the last 31 years in education. A couple of things. One is I heard a lot today about the big picture and that it's not as bad as we think it is. Yet we know that data. And Dr. Hansen, you spoke to this, right? Data can only tell us so much. And we can talk about national averages, but really when it gets down to it, everybody in this room is interested in the data of their individual school, their individual district, our state, which is in a very different place than a lot of states are right now. Thank you for calling out so explicitly the enormous challenge that we're up against in terms of state funding right now. I hope all of you are communicating with the Joint Finance Committee. Today is the last day that you can submit testimony before they close and go into session. But the thing about data that I think is really important to keep in mind that we look at a lot at TNTP is we need to look at the discrete data. So if you're at a district, you need to not just be looking at your overall data, but you need to be looking at your individual school data because you're probably going to see differences between recruitment and retention at certain schools versus other schools. If you are looking at data within your district, you need to be looking at, okay, well, if we're seeing huge amounts of vacancies in special education or math, for instance, is it a recruitment issue or is it a retention issue? Those are two very different problems to solve. And so I find myself looking at data all the time and seeing like, okay, in 2021, there were 5,400 kids that graduated from teacher prep programs in Wisconsin. 1 in 5 of them never got their license. Only 3,600 of them stayed in state. Of those that stayed in state, where did they go to teach and what did they teach? I remember a couple of years ago in Wauwatosa, we were desperately looking for a physics teacher. And when I found out the number of physics teachers that were certified in the state of Wisconsin that year, I was like, no wonder we can't find a physics teacher. So I think we have to look at data in a way that helps us plan both short-term and long-term. The final thing that I'll say is that in terms of my stake in it, I am trying to not get caught up in the very sad state of what is today, and instead looking at the opportunity that this giant debacle of the last couple of years presents us with. So one place that I see excitement and opportunity is a project that TNTP is working on with several other partners. So this is not just a TNTP thing, called 1 Million Teachers of Color, where we've committed to bring in 1 million teachers of color before 2030. And it's a we can't do this alone sort of thing. And there's an energy that comes with partnering with other like-minded organizations that are committed to the same things we are. So that's how I stay connected to this work.
Let me follow up with Leanne first. You work with school districts around the country, or
Yes.
TNTP does. What are you seeing in general in other places as far as their experience with teacher pipeline, the quality of teaching, retention, attraction and retention?
Yep. So the thing that we're seeing across the nation is somewhat similar to what we're seeing in Wisconsin, where new teachers even coming in are not staying more than 3 to 5 years. It really varies as well, whether you're talking about secondary teachers or elementary school teachers. Alt-cert programs, I appreciate you calling out, Dr. Hansen. The quality really varies. And you'll hear from some school leaders, I'd rather have an amazingly energetic person in my school for 3 years and lose them than have a long-term sub in my school until I can find the perfect fit. I would say, again, it goes to district, right? Rural districts are really struggling for teachers because there isn't adequate housing where folks can afford to live and teach given the distance. In terms of the urban areas, you have a lot of alt-cert programs that are actually scaling back at a time where we're anticipating in the next 5 years a huge need for an increase in teachers. I think the data's been interesting, Alan, because, and I feel like you wrote this, some of the things I was reading, this idea that even though in 2020, 28% of teachers said they expected to leave or were considering leaving in the next 2 years, and that went up to 55% in 2022. So 28 to 55%. We actually didn't see that huge drop-off nationally. We did see it regionally in certain districts and whatnot. So again, this is where I think data, you've really got to ask yourself the question, what you're asking, what you're looking at. And I think districts are trying to figure out what the silver bullet is, just like they always do. And as you said, it's super complex. Your district is so different from Wauwatosa, which is different than MPS, which is different than, Kettle Moraine. So I think districts really are trying to figure out what they're going to do when ESSER funding is over, because a lot of people hired staff based on that. I'm really proud TOSA was really thoughtful about their hiring and making sure we weren't creating a situation where all of a sudden we were going to have to do a bunch of layoffs.
Well, one thing that I should have brought up with Dr. Hansen, perhaps, is has technology changed the nature of this issue of teacher quality or the future of teaching? I mean, we went through the pandemic, all the virtual Zoom learning, whatever. Good or bad, is technology affecting what you're seeing in classrooms or what experiences teachers are having? But let's start with you, Dr. Kelsey-Brown.
Okay. So Alan, you said I answered your last question all the way through. I didn't say my stake in it, but I do want to just add that my stake in this work is to ensure that the economic engine of the state of Wisconsin can be viable as we move forward in the future. All of us in this room are going to need the students that we are responsible for educating when we're older, who's going to take care of us. I mean, it's just a reality. And so while, and I'm not making light of it, it is cyclical, as we all know, in the lifespan, in that when we all age, we're going to need the very students that we are responsible for educating to take care of us and drive this economic engine in the state of Wisconsin. I am fearful of what that will look like if we don't do better by our students. Now, back to the technology piece. Well, before I have to go, before I move forward, I just want to recognize one of our board members, Dorothea Macon, is here with us today, Brown Deer board member, and then two of my district administrators, Dr. Glass, Director of Teaching and Learning, and Erica Ramos, Pupil Services. So thank you all for being with us today. Around the technology piece, I actually see more teachers growing in that space in terms of technology, where there might have been some resistance around it because, I've been doing it for 20 years, and this is how I've always done it, and this is how I'm going to continue to do it. One of the silver linings of COVID or the pandemic, I would say, is forcing us into that space and not reverting back necessarily to what we used to do, but truly capitalizing on the technology to meet the needs of students in the classroom. Now, there are some instances where we've had some students who've had some behaviors that did not allow them to stay in the school setting. Now, from an equity perspective, I will share with you, I have a very hard time removing students from the instructional learning environment. It is a tough decision to make. However, when they are jeopardizing their own physical space or other students' physical space, it's just a reality of what we have to deal with. But with that being said, we were able to capitalize on the use of technology and still continue to support our students. And I feel as though in some instances, our teachers are buying into that more. Not that the students are away from us for an extended period of time, but the reality is, given what students have come to us with post-pandemic, the break is necessary in a school setting. Again, that's our reality. So I think technology, the advancements that we have learned as a result of COVID has actually impacted our staff in a way where they're using it and trying to maximize it in a greater way.
Just to add on a little bit, the pandemic definitely put technology in the forefront. That being said, the experience we had is that high school teachers were a little bit more into, like, say, the Google Classrooms and all of that. So that shift was not as drastic. Elementary teachers, whoa. That required quite a bit. And I commend every educator out there because they flipped on a dime. I mean, to go from something that you've always done in person, and you're talking about small groups and whatever, and to figure that out during that time, admirable. That being said, I think you kind of questioned a little bit maybe also as well as how technology and teacher prep programs, I think the verdict is out on that. But what I would say is this. As someone who went through a traditional teacher prep program, I was one of the first cohorts at UW Milwaukee where they required you to do 50 hours of field service every single semester, and then that led up to the one semester of student teaching. It's not enough. We have to re-examine that. Personally, in my opinion, the student teaching experience should last a whole year. You should start from the beginning, go to an end, see what it actually is to work with a teacher who has that experience and to help manage that classroom, build up your skill, because in education, it is a skill set and it requires practice and it requires reflection. And rushing people through that, you get uneven results. I also say that as we're looking to re-examine and redo things, it also is not a job of servitude or whatever. I'm trying to think of a good word, but it's not charity work. We'll put it like that. And what we currently ask people to do who are going through these programs is to drop everything and really just work for free. The work is too important. We have to really be willing to put that investment into programs that allow people to be paid during that student teaching, that allow for people even in higher ed to start thinking about, well, I do want to be a teacher and I should not have to go in debt to do this public service. Even before I get out, I don't want the promise of perhaps my bills will be paid, and I think we know that from the student loan forgiveness debacle that is going on, but why aren't we thinking about doing these things up front? As far as technology in relation to that, I don't think we've had enough time to really know the impact of, let's say, virtual programs, but I am definitely on the side of that people do need more practice. They need in-person experiences. They need to be working with mentors to really get this teaching thing right.
I want to just take a minute and add my perspective. I was supervising student teachers in March of 2020 when schools pivoted, remember that word, to online instruction. What I noticed right away was that the technology surfaced the inequities right away. That in Milwaukee, someone's brought up socioeconomic status. We have a segregated city, and we have children who have more and children who do not have enough. And technology can be an additional way in which those who do not have enough economic resources are further marginalized. And that is probably the biggest notice for me the minute that I student taught. We place our student teachers in public and private schools in the city of Milwaukee and surrounding suburban areas, and the differences were astounding. And we need to pay attention to that. It surfaced this other piece of inequity in our setting.
So a maybe three-part question, but all focused on what would you like to see or what do you expect to see by 5 years or 10 years from now? What do you think is going to be happening? What do you hope will be happening? What would it take to get to the point where your hopes were realized? Let's start with Leanne.
5 years from now. So I think one of the things that we've seen nationwide is decline in ELA in terms of literacy, kids leaving elementary school, going into middle school and high school with the level of reading that they need to be successful. If we think about economic and social mobility beyond kids leaving school, literacy is key. And that's not to say math isn't. I'm sitting beside two math folks. But we've seen a couple of states that have put policy in place specific to reading, and they're actually seeing gains within 3 years. And so one of the things I think would be great to see is some additional policy here in Wisconsin around literacy, and not just, making policy and saying, do this, but how do we actually prepare teachers to be teaching kids how to read? It's one of the hardest skills that there is. And not just reading in elementary, but reading at the secondary level as well, because we can't just abandon our secondary kids and be like, oh, well, they didn't learn, so, we're just going to start with the little ones. So I think literacy is a huge bet, both from a policy standpoint and from a teacher support standpoint. And I think teachers understand that it's a really challenging thing and maybe won't feel... I think one of the things that's really hard for teachers is that you constantly are being told what you're not doing right. And teachers do so many things well, but we also need to acknowledge that this is something that everybody could benefit from, but we need to differentiate for them. So literacy, I would say, is a bet that we would see payoff in a lot of ways, because we also know that when kids are able to read, they feel more confident. They're, going to be able to stay more focused. One of the reasons that we have so many kids that their discipline, is an issue is because they can't engage in the content. So let's give them the tools they need to be successful. Did I answer that? Because it's just one bet. Can I have another bet? If I could say one more thing, I would just say I do think as we think about pipeline, we have to get out of our heads and what we're doing isn't working. And so I think we need to really get in touch with what kids in elementary, middle school, and high school are thinking they want out of their lives and figuring out how to make teacher education a more something that they aspire to, right? That's so that they're not hearing from everyone around them like, oh, you don't want to go into teaching, you're never gonna be able to pay off your debt, or you're never gonna be able to afford. Society sends all of these messages. So I think we actually need to look at our students and say, like, what would make you want to do this, and get beyond the money piece, but also get at like reinventing what schools look like. Because maybe you don't teach the traditional school day. I'm in a place right now where I think we need to be considering really innovative things. Again, because education is one of the few industries where we're doing things the exact same way we were doing them like 100 years ago for all intents and purposes. So that's my other bet.
Ingrid. Okay. Well, what would you like to see the case when it comes, if the phrase we used was strengthening the teaching workforce, what would it take to do that over the next 5 years?
That's a really, really good question.
Like I said, I just asked the questions.
Question as well. Everybody hates to hear it. No matter what, we got to go back to resources. We have to go back to funding. When we talk about making teaching a profession that people do want to go into, it does need to be something where I can say, because we do not have this utopia that we would love to have, that I can pay off my student debts. I can provide for my family. It's not going to be a struggle, because there are a lot of teachers out there who are currently teaching full-time, and I'm getting Uber drivers and everything else. That really is time that they should be able to go home and spend with their family and do a little lesson planning and, get ready for the next day. It's not the reality. We need to be looking at workplace conditions. So class size is not equal across this state. And so you have people, and I'm sure in this room can talk to you about having anywhere from 30 to 50 children in a class. That's not sustainable. You're not going to be able to reach every student. Resource-wise, we have to have fully staffed schools. Every child is deserving of art, music, phy-ed, library. That is not the reality across the state. So students are missing out on those opportunities. That wears on educators in a classroom. It is hard. And then it's also hard to ask them to attempt to continue to do all of those things. We're at a point now, I think if you check WeCan, you'll see every district is out there looking for substitute teachers. Every district is looking for secretaries. They're looking for building service helpers. Every position in a school is understaffed. No matter what, though, those things have to happen. And once again, we're talking about burnout, and we're talking about a workplace that at some point people are like, I can't do this. I have to leave. I love the students. I love the families. I love my school family, but I cannot take that. And I've seen that at a faster pace than I have ever seen. So we have to look at the resources. We have to look at fully funding. We have to look at making the workplace and a place that you actually want to be in and that you can see and feel that success.
All right. So 5 years from now, I have a couple ideas here, one of which is capitalizing all of us who are working in schools. We have some really great paraprofessionals who are working in our buildings. And so in Brown Deer, when we know who those people are, when we know who those employees are, we do encourage them to think about going back to school and pursuing a bachelor's degree. We do have a Grow Your Own program, and we've had a few successful paras were successful in going back to pursue their degree, 2 online, where they didn't have to do the student teaching experience in person, but they already had 4, 5, 6 years in the district, so that experience already came with them. And so capitalizing on them, I think we need to find the space to figure out how to do more of that. I have some outside of the box thinking here. For our teachers, to increase the teacher pipeline, we have to figure out a way to make the work manageable. And I am a strong proponent of what I will call a 4+1 workday week, where 4 days, yes, the teachers are with students. On the one day, I'll share with you what I've done. So I've had a conversation with our executive director of the Y in Brown Deer, where on that one day, we would call it Learning Beyond the Four Walls. And so for parents who need their students to be in school on those 5 days, we would set up some experiential learning at the Y for our students. Our paraprofessionals would provide the support from an employee perspective. And that's a day that we could allow for our teachers who have been asking for years, even when I was in the classroom, we need more time, we need more time. We need more time to look at data. We need more time to collaborate. We need more time to create our lesson plans. We should not expect our teachers to have to go home in the evening and pick up from where they left off in a school day, or do what they do on the weekend, which takes away from their own families. So I think if we, from a state's perspective, if we take a look at interrupting this whole notion of instructional minutes, because we all know our schedule says you gotta have this many instructional minutes at the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. What does that really mean for all intents and purposes in a school day? Yes, on paper, that's what it says, but is that amount of instruction actually really happening in the school? I'll let you all answer that question. But with that being said, if we are able to interrupt some of these parameters that we have wrapped around us that has not yielded any results for us in terms of student achievement, I think that's one way to go. Their flexibility in teacher licensing. So one idea that I have is if we have paraprofessionals who have been in our buildings X amount of years, 3 to 5, pair them up with a master teacher so they can get that, just like we do career and tech ed, experiential learning. Pair them up with a master teacher. Let's have some resources. We can pay that master teacher to provide the on-the-job training for that paraprofessional. I don't know, 1 year, 2 years. That's up to the district, and allow the paraprofessional to then earn some kind of provisional teaching license. Maybe it's not a permanent teaching license, and maybe they don't come in at the same salary as a first-year teacher. Maybe it's just a little less than that because they took an alternative route with the idea that they would continue to increase their salary over time. That's a way to look at it. If the superintendent, a director of teaching and learning, and maybe a principal would endorse that paraprofessional, the master teacher agrees to work with the paraprofessional, that's a provisional licensed professional in your school district. And the caveat to that could be they could only work in that particular school district. So if they choose to go somewhere else, then they lose that provisional. So that's in my mind, that's a creative, innovative idea to think about how we can be flexible in teacher licensing and increase the teacher pipeline. And then the last one is just challenge some of the state statutes that we do have, for example, around credits, the number of credits that a student needs for graduation. Like, what is I don't know how many credits I had to have when I think it was 21 when I graduated. But with that being said, we have students who are going into the tech ed and career in tech ed. They're probably going to go to a 2-year institution. So do they really need 25 credits? How about if we think about a tiered graduation process for students who, if I want to go the skilled trades route, maybe I only need 15 credits, and we make sure they get their reading, their math, the core courses that they need to then transition to a 2-year technical school, or go out and assume an apprenticeship or an internship in the skilled trades. That's an area in the state of Wisconsin where we are lacking majorly And we know we will not be able to AI that. I don't know if a robot will, fix the plumbing in your sink. So those are just some ideas that I have around just thinking outside of the box and showing up to be able to do this work different for the betterment of our children and then for our state.
I'm going to ask Michael Brown to step up and take this seat here if you want, and just your thoughts on what you're hearing in the panel here. And then we'll take some questions and comments from the audience.
Overall, I feel like there was some really great thinking and some ideas. I really like some of this out of the box thinking from Monica. Is that right? And I am with you in that we should be thinking about how to remove the barrier that licensure is and that it poses to many potential incoming teachers. In my view, licensure does perform a function and it does have value. In my view, it does not need to be the only mechanism that does that. And I think that if doing a praxis kind of teacher license or teacher license exam, if that was one way to get into the classroom, and if there's other ways by doing, your paraprofessional training with a mentor teacher, that sounds like a really compelling idea. I think that's an alternative way to get into the classroom. And or maybe we do transcript reviews and high GPA for teachers or something like that. Like, I think it doesn't necessarily have to all be siphoned or all go through this bottleneck, rather, of everyone has to pass this praxis exam, which does have very disparate racial outcomes for test takers. And so I think that's a really important criterion here.
We're a little behind schedule, but not the worst I've ever seen. Let's take several questions, I hope, and then wrap it up. If people have questions, comments, thoughts.
I just want. Oh, let me walk over for the microphone because
Hillary's
we are
coming with the
recording.
microphone.
So, no, that's no problem. Let me hurry over.
Thank you. Okay, so using Denise Clark Pope's quoted term, doing school, she says that we are educating some materialistic, miseducated students. How do you guys find that we can make schools more culturally relevant, make the material more transferable, deal with social, emotional learning issues? And I don't know how to put this, but CRT, how do you achieve that and get rid of when people are trying to get rid of CRT? So I know that's loaded. However you guys can answer it, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll answer from a former school board perspective. So one thing that I think is really important that school districts need to be keeping in mind is how we're raising up student voice. The TOSA school board several years ago added student school board members, which was a huge asset to us because they were able to come in and tell us what the real student experience was. They conducted surveys of their classmates, they talked to their parents and whatnot. And so I think what we heard from them was, we're reading a very narrow list of authors that my parents read, back in 1980. I'm reading The Crucible, I'm reading The Great Gatsby. These things don't appeal to me. And so we started looking at how do we actually think about our curriculum differently. And an immediate step we took was to create a Black Lit course. And I want to be clear, this is not the final answer, because while my own kid took it and thought it was great, it meant that all the other kids in English 9 and English 10 may have not been exposed to those same authors. And so it's really important that we're thinking about expanding the scope of what kids are getting access to, and not just authors of color, female authors who have had different lived experiences, local authors that kids can identify with. And thinking about how those things fit into the curriculum, I think is a really important first step. And I want to acknowledge that, everything has a process in a school district, right? Like there's curriculum councils and there are state statutes that require parents to have access to knowing when a curriculum is going to be changed and whatnot. And so I think it's important that districts think about when they're going to be doing something that may be politically charged and how to get in front of that so that they build investment in the community, in the students, in the teachers, and don't make the mistake of making assumptions. Y'all might have heard we got ourselves in a little bit of a pickle through our human growth and development curriculum that we may have avoided had we done more front-end investment. So I don't think you can necessarily get around those things, but I think you can be strategic in how you build investment and voice on the front end that will allow you to get a better outcome.
Else wants, or we can...
Can I jump in just one very small comment and then to Leigh? One thing that I think oftentimes, like especially like we're talking about technology in the classroom, I think one way that that we don't really fully have an appreciation of is the fact that social media and a lot of cultural things are happening for kids in this, especially secondary, middle, and high school kids. Like they're extremely influenced outside of the classroom. And the classroom, because they don't talk to their parents about it, they don't talk to other leaders about it, the classroom really becomes the only way that they have voice or that they really even address some of these issues. And I think this is something that's often, just totally ignored in typical conversations when we're talking about anti-CRT or anti-LGBT issues. But it's something that, like, in a way, like, teachers and educators are in a unique position in these schools, in these students' lives, and they're, and many times, like, they're forced to offer something that they don't necessarily, like, it wasn't part of the lesson plan, but the kids are sort of organically bringing it up too. And so I think that it's important to recognize that dynamic. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Leigh.
I was just going to add to this idea that this brings me back to the state teaching standards and the idea of quality. The third standard that our students work on at Marquette University, any other university in a teacher prep program, is understanding the learning differences that all of their students bring to the classroom. This is a standard by which we are judged as well in our observations and evaluations. And, I am the face of the Wisconsin teacher. I am white and female, and most of the teachers in our state look like us. And yet, throughout my career, I was born, raised, and educated in the Milwaukee area. My parents were both educators. I needed to learn quickly that there are different perspectives, different pieces of literature, different anchors in communities, the assets that other communities and children bring into our school. And for me, your question, Dorothea, brings up the importance of, in a teacher preparation program and other places, of centering the rich assets that our diverse students bring right into our classroom, beginning in 4-year-old kindergarten. They come with their families. Those of you who have been a parent know this. You can barely untangle them from your family, and those families are different. And that's where the differences begin, and that's where teachers need to learn how to respond and build on the assets that these children bring as their differences into the classroom.
Yes, and I am not the face of education. In fact, there are 2 African-American female superintendents in our state out of 420 districts. And so while we talk about the teacher pipeline, it's in every, you can look at every category of personnel. But with that being said, Ms. Macon, if we can figure out a way to give students more voice and choice as it relates to what they want to learn, what are they interested in, I do believe we have a generation of students who, if they're not interested in it, they are checking out. I mean, that is our reality in schools right now. Students are avoiding school because I have this in my hand on a consistent basis, and I can learn from this, right? So if we can balance, probably similar to what you were saying, balance this that they have 24/7. And what's interesting about COVID is the very thing that we would say to parents is, make sure you limit the time that your students are on a tablet or on a computer, and then we put them on it for 8 hours. And now we're trying to climb out of that. But if we can find a way to balance this mini computer, if you will, with giving students more voice and choice in our school setting as it relates to what they're interested in. Now, with that comes what? Resources. I think that will put us in a better place with our students. Again, voice and choice, including if I'm going into the skilled trades, let me get the 15 credits so I can go on out there and get the internship or the apprenticeship. Now, if I'm going to college, I probably need the 21 or 25 credits. Not probably, you do need the 21 or 25 credits. But right now, I'm in school district X, and I got to have 25 credits to graduate. That's it. So I think that would be something to look at. One of the conversations I've had with our principals at the middle and the high school is to make SEL a class, make it an elective. We are going to have to, so we're bringing in external partners to help our students in that SEL space as it relates to dealing with trauma or, whatever their challenges are. But if we provided those strategies to our students on a daily basis, that's one thing we can assure or ensure when our students leave us, they have those coping strategies in their tool belt, that wherever they go, they can apply that. That's two. And then on the CRT side, I am just really, first of all, I think we all need to be mindful of where CRT all started. It didn't start in K-12. It started in a law school. Law school. And so let's be mindful of where it all started and the definition behind it. Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe, is the one who coined the term, critical race theory. But with that being said, I have been very fortunate as a superintendent in the school district of Brown Deer in that has not been my fight. That has not been my fight, and I'm grateful and thankful for that. And so in that space, I think we're doing very well. I've had one phone call from a community member around CRT. We have all kinds of books in our libraries for our students to have access to represent who they are and the experiences that they come with. So I've been very fortunate in that regard. But the other two ideas, Ms. Macon, is something that we should, definitely think about moving forward.
I think we need to end the program. Why? That's a really good question. I was going to say, not that I'm eager to do that. I didn't expect we were going to resolve anything here today or find a clear and simple path forward, because there aren't such things. But I think we have offered a lot of good information, a lot of good thoughts, a lot of, I hope, provocative thoughts in the sense of motivating everyone to get involved, stay involved, become more involved in exactly the phrase we started with, strengthening the teacher workforce, because it is so crucial. So my great thanks to all of you for being here. I want to single out Hillary DeBlois, there she is, who the program manager for the Lubar Center, for working a lot on putting this all together. I definitely want to thank the members of our panel, Leanne Fraley and Monica Kelsey-Brown and Ingrid Walker-Henry and Leigh Van Den Kieboom from Marquette. And I especially want to thank our guest from Washington, Michael Hansen from the Brookings Institution. And I hope we'll all stay tuned in to each other, to people like Michael Hansen, and stay involved. So thank you greatly. We will do more.